And the reason is so ridiculous, and that is so we can more effectively beg for reparation crumbs from our slave master. Show me why it is scientifically necessary for you to disidentify from being an African so you can beg for crumbs from your slave master. It makes no sense. And here's what we got to understand real quickly.
Okay.
White people outnumber black people in America 1 to 6.
For sure.
1 to 6. So if you allow them into your struggle and you don't control how many of them participate, they automatically co-opted just by virtue of the strength of their numbers. And that's why we have to learn how to fight alone. Also, when you look at our history with coalitions with other races, they always get more out of the coalition than we do. And we need to understand that the solution to the proper education of black children is for them to be taught by their own community, okay? And that their own community should have their own schools. Our greatest embarrassment as Africans in America is the fact that we have not created yet 402 years under white supremacy, even longer before white supremacy, we have not created an independent school system for our own children. That is the eternal disgrace of the black man and woman in America. We spend $4 billion a year on alcohol, $2 billion a year on Nike, $4 billion a year on children's cologne. Black men, $30 million on cosmetics. Black women, $30 billion on hair and cosmetics, $700 billion on chicken, beef, pork, and turkey. How do you explain being in the 21st century, 400 years later, with all of the maladies that our children suffer in the school system, and we still refuse to build our own schools for our own children?
Wow. And that's what you're on a mission to do, building this school that you have now. That's what you're on a mission to correct that. But don't you feel like it starts with one, though? Like if people see you do it, then a domino effect to happen, other black educators to step up to the plate and start to do that. Is that why it's so important for what you're doing?
I do think that once the FDMG Academy is open, it will inspire others to follow that path. But at the same time, we should not have to wait for Dr. Umar to do one, because you have other independent schools that have existed and been built long before me. So it's no excuse. We have nothing but educators. We have more educators than anything else in the black community, professionally speaking. So it's no excuse why we haven't done more for our children. I say all the time, if you really want to see how much of people really respect themselves, you watch how they treat their children. There is no excuse for us not to have our own schools for our children, which is related to a larger problem. And that is that the American African does not want to take responsibility for his or her destiny. We're the only non-white people in America who want no financial responsibility to change their condition. Whenever we talk about our problems, it's all about we need to vote. Whenever we talk about our problems, it's all about we need reparations. Whenever we talk about our problems, it's always about we need to protest. Stop all that. Before you can talk about external reparations, you have to talk about internal reparations. What do we owe ourselves? What do we owe our people? What do we owe our community? What do we owe our ancestors? Don't tell me what the white man owes me. Tell me what you owe us.
I love that. I love that. So let's get into it, since you brought up reparations. All right, let's get into it. All right. So there seems to be this big rift and divide between the ADOS community and the African diaspora community regarding reparations, and the African diaspora being left out of reparations. What do you feel is the main divide between that conversation that's being had now between the ADOS community and the African immigrants, as I'll call them?
Well, first of all,
studying that.
First of all, of the 50 million Africans in America, only about 3 million are African immigrants. America is not in love with African people. And most of those African immigrants are here on an education visa or an employment visa or a visitation visa. It is very difficult to get your American citizenship as an African in America. That's why you only have 3 million. Africa is a continent of over 1 billion people, and you only have 3 million. So clearly America is not in love with the African immigrant. The problem that I take with these organizations is that they are playing upon the intergenerational self-hatred that we have had being African as long as we've been in America. If you want to find fault with another group who you feel has undermined Black progress in America, why haven't you named the feminist movement? Why haven't you named the LGBTQ? Why haven't you named the non-African immigrants? You haven't spoken about the Italians. You haven't spoken about the European Jews. You haven't spoken about the Irish. They have taken more from Black progress over the past 100 years than the African immigrant. The LGBTQ has taken more from Black progress than the African immigrant. The white woman and every other woman has taken more from Black progress than the African immigrant. To me, it is very cowardly to blame the lowest man on the totem pole because you're too afraid to go after the real groups who are responsible for undermining Black progress. And putting that to the side, it's harmful because we are at a time right now with the quadricentennial that occurred 2 years ago, 1619 to 2019. It represented a time where Africans around the world are beginning to come together. The president of Ghana declared 2019 a year of return. You had other African heads of state saying we want our kith and kin in the diaspora to come home. You had Jamaica and other islands reaching out to the American African. So at a time when the vision of the most honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, and the vision of Kwame Nkrumah, and the vision of El Hajj Malik El Shabazz and all the great Pan-Africanists is finally being realized, you get these YouTubian opportunists. You get these YouTubian opportunists who wake up, come out of nowhere, having no history of grassroots struggle. Let me say that again. The founders of these movements have no history of grassroots struggle. They are YouTubian opportunists trying to drive a wedge between Africans in the East and Africans in the West. And the reason is so ridiculous, and that is so we can more effectively beg for reparation crumbs from our slave master. Show me why it is scientifically necessary for you to disidentify from being an African so you can beg for crumbs from your slave master. It makes no sense. So you will call yourself a slave, but you won't call yourself an African. You will call yourself an American, but you won't call yourself an African. One group calls themselves slaves. The other group call themselves American. Neither one of them really wants to be Black.
Okay, you get into it. So just so for healing purposes, what would be your message to the ADOS community?
I don't have a message, and I'm going to tell you why.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you why, though. That man whose picture hangs behind me,
Marcus Garvey.
The Honorable Marcus Garvey.
Yes, sir.
His example will stand the test of time. So I don't spend a lot of time on ADOS. I don't spend a lot of time on FBA because I know the reason why they exist.
Yes.
And I know who brought them forward. And I know how serious the people are who brought them forward. I know they're just temporary opportunist schemes. So I'm not concerned about that. 100 years from now, that flag will still be flying, the red, black, and green. Not the ones these opportunists are making up. So I don't give them a lot of attention because I have so much faith in our people to raise their consciousness to the point where they can understand, understand, and overstand what they're really supposed to be about. And that is about revolutionary Pan-African nationalism. It is all of us or none of us. We rise together or we don't rise at all. It is all for one and one for all. It is Garveyism or get the hell away from me.
Wow. Powerful, Dr. Umar. Powerful, powerful. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit because I know this is an important question. A lot of people in Louisville want to know from you, and this is something that's very important to them as well. I know you haven't been here in 6 years. And of course, a lot has changed in Louisville, Kentucky in 6 years, especially the unrest that we saw in 2020 as it relates to the Breonna Taylor situation. As you were on the outside looking in, how did you feel about that situation, knowing that you had been to this community, you know the people in this community, and you know the needs of this community. How did you feel looking at us going through that unrest, that civil unrest?
Okay. And I'm going to respond to that question with a slightly broader angle.
Okay.
In that, when we look at the protests, which I refer to as the 2020 protests for justice, that was triggered by the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, I was disgusted because this was the most significant, comprehensive, protracted Black protests since the Dr. King assassination protests of '68. Black people had not protested that long, that qualitatively, for that amount of time since the Dr. King assassination protests. We wasted an opportunity to force the Black agenda on the American table for public discussion. We made 3 mistakes with the 2020 protests for justice. Mistake number 1, we had no clearly articulated list of demands. We were protesting without telling the government what it was we wanted specifically. Are you following me there? So we marching, but what are you marching for? What specifically? We understand you reacting to the, as you should. But after you react, we now have to create some political structure and agenda. That never happened. In other words, we never say all the police in the Black community need to look like the Black community. We never said the unjustified of an unarmed African should automatically be considered a hate crime. We never say that whenever you murder a Black person unjustifiably, you are automatically charged and must be proven in a court of law that you are innocent and will never again be allowed to police in the Black community the rest of your life. We never put no demands. We didn't talk about miseducation. We didn't talk about gentrification. We didn't talk about police genocide. We didn't talk about access to wealth. We didn't talk about massing. The issues that matter to Black America, which largely ignored during the time that we protested. So that's number 1. You had no plan. Number 2, you had no identified spokespersons. You didn't necessarily need to have an identified leader because they would either kill him or co-opt him or her. But you needed spokespersons to articulate the agenda. And as a result of us not having no spokespersons, guess what happened? The Democratic Party swooped in and exploited the 2020 protests for justice into a Joe Biden voters drive. They turned the whole thing into, we got to get rid of Trump and we got to put Biden in office, although Biden's record in office is no better than Trump's was. You don't let the Democratic Party exploit your pain so they can get people elected. So number 1, no plan. Number 2, no spokespersons. And number 3, and probably the most significant of the 3, we allowed non-Africans to invade and to ultimately co-opt the protests themselves. There was one research statistic that I read which stated that only 1 out of every 6 protesters were Black. Only 1 out of every 6 protesters were Black. How do you let non-Africans invade your protests and then take them over? And so when the protest was over, what did Donald Trump sign into law? The Hispanic Prosperity Initiative. The outcome of the protests was the Hispanic Prosperity Initiative. The outcome of the protest was presidential candidate, now President Joe Biden, saying we can have a conversation about reparations, but we have to include the Native Americans. What else came out of the protests? The Supreme Court had made a decision on LGBT rights as they relate to the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. So everybody got something out of the protests except Black people, and it was our fault. Because one of the eternal mistakes that we make, that the most honorable Marcus Garvey has tried to teach us about 100 years ago, and that is the essential need to struggle alone, to fight alone, to stand alone. Whatever is to be done for Black people must be done by Black people. But because of our self-hatred and because of our low African self-esteem, because of our need to be accepted by our oppressor, we don't want to do anything by ourselves. We want to hold hands with everybody, even though they don't want to hold hands with us.
Now, excuse me if I'm being sensitive because I'm from Louisville, all right? But I agree with you on the last 2 points. Number one, where we had no clear demands. We did have those demands. Those demands just were not met. But we can speak about that a little bit more when you get in town and have a conversation with the people in the community. But we did have those demands that were not met. But I agree. I think the fact that we had no clear leader, I agree that hurt us. And I agree that we allowed non-African people to invade the movement because we never had numbers when it came to our people. Louisville, we never had that. So I agree with you on those 2 points, definitely.
And but here's what we got to understand real quickly.
Okay.
White people outnumber Black people in America 1-6.
For sure.
1-6. So if you allow them into your struggle and you don't control how many of them participate, they automatically co-opted just by virtue of the strength of their numbers. And that's why we have to learn how to fight alone. Also, when you look at our history with coalitions with other races, they always get more out of the coalition than we do. There's a rule of political organization. It's a rule that I came up with, but I'm sure some of our ancestors spoke to it. Disorganized groups have no business forming alliances with more organized groups. Are you following me?
Yeah.
If you are disorganized, you have no business seeking a coalition with a more organized group because they will exploit you by virtue of your disorganization. Get organized first before you ever seek a coalition with a non-African entity.
Wow, get organized. Now that's some organizing for you. I love that.